I welcome you all to the Fall British Debate. Our topic today, the legalization of recreational drugs, is much in the news. For instance, 2 states have legalized cannabis and 22 other states have decriminalization or medical marijuana laws on the books. There is some movement in our own state to legalize marijuana, and the issue has proven to be very divisive. So we are privileged to have with us today 2 award-winning members of the National British Debating Team. First, we have Kate Brooks. Kate is a postgraduate student reading for the doctorate in philosophy and international relations at the University of Oxford. In her work, she examines the historical evolution of conceptions of territory in international theory and practice. She also works as a consultant researcher for the United Nations Economic and Social Commission for Western Asia. Kate is head of competitive debating at the Oxford Union and a successful competitive debater, having currently the 5th best rated speaker in Europe. We also have Alice Coombs Huntley. Alice has recently graduated from the University of Bristol with a first-class degree in English literature. She is hoping to continue her education and study for a master's degree in Victorian literature in 2015. Alice has been involved with the English Speaking Union since she was a teenager, first as a member of England World Schools team, and now as a mentor and England team committee member. As a debater, she has won 3 national competitions, reached the finals of countless others, and has broken the world schools. World Universities and European Universities Championships, her team was ranked 4th best in Europe in 2013. She has also judged as many school and university competitions, most notably as co-chief adjudicator of the ESU John Smith Memorial Mace, commonly known as the English National Championships. Alice is looking forward to traveling around the United States, meeting new people, and is especially excited about eating lots of American food. The format for the debate will be as follows. Each debater will have a 5-minute opening speech, including points of information between minutes 1 and 4. This will be followed by a second round of closing remarks, and this will be followed by a second round. Then there will be 15-minute audience participation, so you will be able to give questions. And then there will be a 5-minute closing on each side. So please join me in welcoming Kate Brooks and Alice Coombs Huntley.
Ladies and gentlemen, I will be proposing the motion today, but before I begin my speech, Kate and I have a few thank yous that we want to say before we get started. Firstly, a huge thank you to Chesapeake Community College for organising this whole event and hosting the British team for several years. You've made us feel very welcome, and so thank you to all of you in the audience for giving up your time. Hopefully we'll give you an interesting debate and you won't feel that you've wasted a morning. A second thank you to David Harper, our host, who's organised this whole thing and been the man behind the scenes organising everything. So a really big thank you to you. And thirdly, to Cathy Rust, who very kindly let us stay at her home last night and was so welcoming and let us become a little bit part of her family, at least for a night. So thank you so much to all of you from the bottom of our hearts. Okay, now on to my speech. So ladies and gentlemen, you probably are wondering what a 22-year-old English girl has to say about drugs. And it's true, I'm not a drug dealer. I've not tried a huge amount of the drugs that you in the US might have. But in England, we do have a drug problem. It dominates all social life. You need it to really talk to anyone. You need it to start your day. You need several cups, they're the measurements you get of it in a day. You might have heard of it. It's called tea. It's pretty addictive. What can I say? As a nation, we're held to it. But you know what? Also, it's delicious. And it's brilliant. We like it. And we bond over it. And I think many drugs can actually have beneficial effects that many individuals want to consent to, but are told they can't by the law. So in my first speech, I'm going to talk to you about freedom and consent, and why actually individuals should be allowed to take these drugs. They should be free to, and they can meaningfully consent to do so, and the government has no place in stopping them from doing so. And then in my second speech, I'm going to talk to you a little bit more about the practicalities and why actually we have a safer and healthier nation if drugs are made legal. But before I do that, just to explain how this would work. So all recreational drugs would be legalized, there's no limitations on this, and they'd be sold very similarly to alcohol or cigarettes. So there would be age restrictions on them. There'd probably be some sort of health warning, and we have that in the UK. I'm not sure if you do on cigarette packets, but just being like, you know, if you take lots of like crystal meth, you may end up looking like this, so people sort of know what they're getting into. We'd also tax it, so that would be beneficial for all of the problems that drugs would cause, but we would be ending the war on drugs. It would be legal to buy and to sell drugs, and you could buy them anywhere where you can really buy alcohol or cigarettes today. Okay, so on to freedom. Now, why is freedom important? Freedom is such a part of, American culture, freedom, go USA. But what does it mean? Why do we say that freedom is so important? Well, it's about control, isn't it? It's about saying that your life is your own and you should be able to live the life you want to do. And so we say you should have the most freedom possible, because the more choices you have available to you, the more ways you can determine how you live your life, what your life looks like, and hopefully that makes you happier, because you can make decisions on an everyday basis about things that affect you and do things you want to do. But sometimes we do restrict freedom. And so when do we restrict it? Sometimes it's about balancing others' rights. So for example, in America, the right to bear arms is something that's a big cause to lots of people. So you're allowed to carry a gun. But we do say that others have a right to life, so you're not allowed to shoot someone with that gun, because that would affect someone else's right to life in a rather unfortunate manner. But we do say that in terms of drugs, you're not restricting anyone else's rights in the same way that if I light up a cigarette, as long as I don't blow it in your face and we restrict where you can smoke, I'm not impacting your life in any way. My choice is not harming you. Similarly, when I have a gin or two at the end of the day, I'm not affecting your life. And if I was doing, we criminalise those actions. So I'm not allowed to drink and drive, but I am allowed to drink. And the point is, no free choice is perfect. It will impact you as an individual in some way. But we think you should choose how you want your life to be. And for many individuals, drugs can actually be a great experience. They can open up your mind to whole other things. You can get high, and that can be fun, and that can be enjoyable. We think that's something you should be free to do. Yes, Kate?
To what extent is someone who is addicted to crystal meth making a meaningful choice to take their next hit?
They're making a meaningful choice in the same way that someone who is addicted to alcohol makes that meaningful choice. Lots of things become habitually addictive. I did not know that when I started debating at 15, and it was a fun hobby I did once a month, I'd be spending 2 months in America doing that every day. You could say I had very little choice that because I'm addicted to the hobby, but that's fine. So on to consent. Every choice we make limits your future choice. If you buy a cup of coffee today, we're students and we're on a budget, so you might be drinking water tomorrow. We accept you can do this, where you say you can smoke, you can eat what you want. I ate more ribs in Texas than anyone human should do. I felt ill afterwards, but we say I can choose to make that decision even if it has negative effects. You can join the army and give up your life for your country. Why? Because it's your life. And you only have one, and you can reasonably weigh up the harms and benefits of anything, in the same way that if you ride a motorcycle, it's dangerous, but you're allowed to make that decision. You never know the impact of any choice, what it will actually be, but most drugs are no worse for you in terms of the science testing of them than alcohol or cigarettes. You should be able to decide that you want a shorter life, but one that is more fun and more enjoyable. And if for you that means taking heroin, that means taking cocaine, that means taking marijuana, you should be allowed to do it. Because this is America, and you are free, and you can consent. So please propose this motion. Thank you.
So, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to firstly reiterate Alice's thanks to everyone. Also come from me as well. We've had an absolutely fantastic time so far in Maryland. Now, a lot of you might be expecting that I'm going to stand up here and say, no, America's war on drugs is right, the current policy is correct. I'm not going to do that, because in order for a policy to be defensible, it has to be both justified and effective. And it is our position that the current American policy on drugs is neither. However, the response to that should not be an a priori legalization of all recreational drugs. There is a much more sensible policy to be had here in the grey zone. One that doesn't mean that you're imprisoning everyone who takes marijuana, but one that does mean you're not legalizing things like crocodile, which are known as drugs that eat your face, for people to have within society. So what might a more reasonable policy look like, one where we do think that many drugs should be illegal? Firstly, I'm not about to defend that any user of drugs should ever end up in prison. We think people who are addicted to drugs are essentially victims and not criminals. We therefore think that they should never be in prison. But the people who should be in prison are the people who deal those drugs to them, are the people who take advantage of vulnerable individuals to make money from them and then use that to fund a life of crime. To be clear, under Alice's side, those people have impunity and they are able to act as they please. On our side, we would punish them, and we would punish them harshly. So, what might this policy look like? We think there is firstly some drugs that probably should just be legalized. Things like cannabis, there is no evidence to say that it is more harmful than alcohol or that criminalization has any positive effect. We think there are certain drugs, therefore, that should probably be legalized, such as cannabis, cocaine, ecstasy. Criminalizing them doesn't seem to have a positive effect. There are other drugs, however, which are incredibly addictive and harmful, like heroin or crystal meth. Criminalization, again, doesn't work here because it just simply pushes these drugs into the realm of criminals and causes things like the drugs war in Mexico. What we would do, however, is, even though they would be legal, is that they would be prescription only, and that if you are an addict, you have to register with a doctor and you have to go and get your medication from them. This means that anyone who is a heroin or a crystal meth addict, rather than being put as a criminal within the system, is seen as a victim and provided with the health care that they need. Then there are some drugs which think that it is frankly should never be legalized. These are things like crocodile, which are known to cause irreparable damage, or other things that you inject, in which case cause irreparable damage. These things should always be illegal. People shouldn't be allowed to take them.
Point of information?
Yeah.
If you can consent to some harm, so say heroin or cigarettes, why can't you consent to more harm, so choose to take crocodile?
So it's quite obvious here that there is a significant distinction. Alice wants to tell you that alcohol is addictive, debating is addictive, and tea is addictive. Note, the vast majority of people who take alcohol, who do debating, or who take cannabis do not become addicts. Nearly everyone who takes crystal meth or heroin becomes an addict. That is the distinction in terms of harm, and that is the thing that we think that the government has a right to say that this is different. So I'm going to talk then about consent and choice. So we can agree that the role of government should be to maximise the choice of the individual and to respect citizen consent. However, in the case of the kind of drugs that I want to ban, or really restrict to prescription only, so really addictive drugs, your ability to meaningfully consent to taking these drugs once you've taken the first one is nothing. A person who is a crystal meth addict cannot meaningfully consent to taking the next hit because there is no choice available to them. They feel compelled physically to do that. That is not a meaningful choice that the government has a duty to respect. Moreover, when they take that initial choice to take that first hit of heroin or take that first hit of crystal meth, these people aren't realizing what they're signing up for. There is no ability to comprehend when you do this of the kind of life that you're going to have to lead as a result of this. Again, not meaningful consent. And the government does restrict your choices in these ways when you have to protect future choices. So we don't allow children to drop out of school at the age of 11 because doing so would really inhibit their future choices. We don't allow people to commit suicide because doing so obviously really inhibits their future choices. The government, therefore, can distinguish between meaningful and non-meaningful choice and restrict current choice in order to protect future choice. Fundamentally, on our side, we're actually protecting people's future choices, protecting them from making non-meaningful choices, and punishing those who exploit vulnerable people in order to make money. Very proud to oppose.
Okay, at this time, we will now have our second round of 5-minute speeches.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, I think Kate's opposition is very clever and sounds like a good solution, right? Because you're cutting out, all the criminal elements. That you're not having the war on drugs because users aren't being criminalized anymore. The problem is, if you're still criminalizing those who sell it, users do feel that they are still taking part in a criminal activity because they can't go into a shop and buy marijuana. They have to go down a back alley and buy it from someone incredibly dodgy and someone who does threaten them and say, I will stab you if you don't give me more money and encourage your friends to take this. People do not feel that they can go to the government because a taboo does still exist. So in my speech, I'm going to talk to you about safety and why it is safer if all drugs are legal and we can't set arbitrary divisions where they are and aren't legal. But before I do that, let's look a little at what Kate said and explain why, while her sort of aim might be honourable, it's misguided. Okay, so firstly, this idea that under my system, drug lords would not be punished. I would be like, hello, Mr. Drug Lord, welcome. Please make all my citizens addicts, that is fine. Well done, top fellow. Untrue. Why? Because I would be selling it like cigarettes and alcohol. You would have to sell it through a shop and be registered. We do not think drug lords would do this. Why? Because they are often involved in other criminal activities. But even if they run a shop, you can choose to go to other shops. All the intimidation and all the factors that exist when you are buying it in a covert and illegal way, or at least they want you to do that because it's still illegal for them to sell it to you, do not exist under my system.
Point of information.
No, thank you. Secondly, this idea that you can get some things, you can do this, I'm not just being terribly rude, you can get this on prescription from a doctor. The problem is, it's still illegal to buy normally. So those people at the first instance, when they are taking crocodile or they are taking crystal meth, are still mixing with criminal elements and are still being intimidated and still know that purchase is illegal. So see the fact that often if you are an addict, you're quite paranoid and you often are engaging in other criminal activities. It's unlikely suddenly they're going to say, oh yes, I will go to a doctor and tell the state the illegal thing I have been doing and think, oh yes, they actually will be nice to me. I think there is a history of not being terribly nice to drug addicts. They won't trust this. Thirdly, this idea that with certain addictions you have no meaningful choice when you first do it. Why? Every choice you make impacts your life. If you spend all your money on a PlayStation and you don't have enough for rent the next month, that impacts your life. It is unclear what meaningful means in terms of choice. I can go out and get terribly drunk just because I want to. There's no real meaning for this other than I thought it was fun. Right? There's nothing higher going on in my head. Why then do we need to have this arbitrary division of meaningful choice? Even if something does become addictive afterwards, notice you can stop taking crystal meth if you really want to. In the same way that under Kate's model, she says you can stop taking heroin. Yes, you have to join rehab, but you can do it. It's unclear what the difference is. Lastly, this issue of children and choice. The reason that we say children cannot make choices that will impact their life is because we say you are immature and you lack the understanding and comprehension of the world to mean that you can make certain choices. If at 18, your government says you are intelligent enough to give up your life for the army, why are you not intelligent enough to decide whether or not you want to take drugs? Yes.
Under your side, you have an a priori legalization of all recreational drugs. When you say that the current drugs available are being sold in off-licenses, this means that existing drug dealers will experiment with new drugs and can sell them with impunity. Don't we solve that on my side?
They can't sell them with impunity. In the same way that if I make moonshine in my basement, I can't sell it with impunity. Also, why on earth would you go to a dodgy drug dealer when you can go to like Walmart and buy the drugs and they're safer and probably cheaper and there's not someone also saying, oh, you owe me money, do you become a prostitute. It's just Walmart saying, give me the money, we'll make a transaction. So why is it safer under my side? Because there's better quality drugs. Because the government is checking what is going into them. You're not having marijuana that's cut with fiberglass. Because we take the drug gangs out of it. Otherwise, they are always there selling certain drugs that have been deemed illegal. But also for occasional users. Note that Kate wants to make this a debate purely about those on crocodile having their face eaten by drugs. There are also a vast majority of Americans who take all sorts of drugs, take even some dangerous drugs, but just occasionally. All of those are safer if they can take them from the off-license. And there is no reason for them ever to experiment with newer drugs that haven't been made legal or are seen as too dangerous by the government, because they can always get the safer option. Ladies and gentlemen, you should be free to do this. It is safer if they are all legal. I urge you to propose. Thank you.
Okay, in my second speech, I'm going to talk some about the practicalities of how these models work in practice and why addicts, first-time users, and society generally is better under our side. Firstly, some rebuttal. So we have this claim from Alice that when you take drugs, you're not harming anyone but yourself. I mean, that's obviously factually untrue, right? The distinction between harm to yourself and harm to society isn't clear. When you become a crystal meth addict, that has enormous health consequences that your society pays for. When you become a heroin addict, that has enormous consequences for your employment potential. You are usually unemployed. Again, something your society pays for. Given that we have a commitment in society, we can't just let people die, society therefore surely has a right to say there are certain choices which aren't valid because you can't be a functioning member of society, and we have to take care of you. That's just not dealt with on Alice's side. Moreover, she says that, well, under my model, people will still go to the drug dealer for their first shot of heroin, because going to the pharmacy or going to the doctor will be embarrassing. I mean, probably may be true, but the problem is that drug dealers can only sustain their incredibly expensive drug wars because they rely on a significant proportion of long-term users. If the only market they have is a very small proportion of people who now want to be first-time users, that is not enough to sustain their activities. Fundamentally, therefore, they will be driven out of the market purely on a cost basis. Moreover, it's incredibly expensive to buy heroin from a drug dealer. Pharmaceutically manufactured heroin, however, is pennies, so this stuff could be produced incredibly cheaply. I think that when you have a difference between paying $1 for a shot of heroin and $100, I'd probably face the embarrassment and pay $1 at the doctor's. Then she said, well, every choice impacts your life. Every choice restricts future choices. I mean, there's obviously a qualitative difference here. Yes, when I started doing debating, it meant it was more difficult to do academic work, but that's very different from the first time I take crystal meth, and that physically reducing my ability to be not addicted to crystal meth. That is a totally different kind of restriction of choice. When you become addicted to these drugs, that removes your ability to make all of the kind of future choices you would want to. Not only because you are so addled from taking these drugs, but because you are physically prohibited from getting off these drugs without significant help. She then said, well, actually dealers will be fine on our side. Note there has to be a difference. If you are a priori legalizing all recreational drugs, even if you're making them illegally, that can only be punished in the same way that making alcohol illegally would be, which is a slap on the wrist. Under our side, we're saying certain things are illegal, which means you still get 20 years in prison. They said, well, people won't go to them because they'll just want to go to Walmart. I mean, notice that people, when they become addicted to drugs, don't just say, well, I'll just stick with cocaine, or I'll just stick with ecstasy. They want the harder drug, they want the harder high, because that's what your body craves for. So there is still reason, under her side, why people would want those new and better drugs and want to go to drug dealers.
Point of information.
Yeah.
Given that under your model you're still giving out the hard drugs on prescription, you can see that some people will still be taking these hard drugs, even if at first they do it illegally. Isn't it safer and better for everyone if you're never taking drugs from dodgy drug dealers, but always taking it from state-endorsed shops?
So the reason that we would take it from dodgy dealers on your side is on my side, all the dealers have got is those people who first want to take heroin. On your side, they have this whole array of new new legal drugs that they can constantly change and constantly create and sell for no other punishment than being like, well, it's kind of like selling alcohol illegally. So there is obviously much more sale of drugs from drug dealers on your side. A couple of questions then. Which side best protects casual users? On both sides, it's clear we have a safer and more regulated drug market for people who want to smoke cannabis or who want to take things like cocaine. But which side best protects addicts? On proposition, you have free and easy access to any kind of drug that you want. This means if you are a heroin addict, you can simply go to the store and buy the poison that is killing you. On my side, you have to see a doctor in order to get that. This means you have monitoring, you have healthcare, you have an easy way into the healthcare system where they can say, go to rehabilitation. Under Alice's side, you have none of that. People are taking heroin, people are taking crystal meth, we don't know who they are, we don't know where they are, we don't know how best to protect their health. Obviously, they're better protected on my side. And then which side best protects citizens from the most harmful drug? To be clear, on proposition, where they're having an a priori legalization of all drugs, you do have equal access to things like crocodile as you do to cannabis. Those things will be equally easy to get, and addicts necessarily will move on to the harder high. On our side, on my side, we make that much less likely, because while you can go to an off-license and buy marijuana, you can't go and buy crocodile. You also can't go to the doctors and buy crocodile. You can go and buy heroin, but those really, really harmful drugs will not be on the market, and we will punish severely anyone who sells them.
Okay, at this time, we will now open the floor to questions. So please, direct your questions to these awesome debaters.
If you have a question, please queue right here at this aisle and ask your question from this microphone. Okay? Thank you. It's not quartered, so I can deliver it to your seat. If you have a question, raise your hand.
Hi, you guys both referred to a drug, and I think we might call it something different in this country. I think you were saying crocodile. What is that exactly?
So this is a drug that has emerged in Russia. I don't know the precise chemical compound, but it is also in the United States. And it's known as the cannibal drug because you inject it, and it's fairly a similar thing to heroin. However, this specifically degrades all of your muscle mass when you inject it. So the people who are taking it are losing limbs, they are having parts of their faces literally fall off. These are the kind of drugs that are most harmful that are becoming available now.
Yeah, my question was for you guys. You said people could make the conscious decision to join the military and risk their lives as well as take drugs and risk their lives. Like, how can you compare a selfless act to a selfish act?
Well, the point is in both acts, you're saying that you have consent over things that might impact your life. So in both things, we're saying when you join the military, people are saying it's up to you whether you decide ultimately to risk your life and defend your country. So it's the risking your life part that's important. So similarly, when you're taking drugs, presumably you are equally capable to make the same decision there. So while they are different acts and maybe viewed differently by society, in terms of the consent that you are giving, it's the same principle.
My question is if we sell these drugs legally, like you said, we will still have people selling these drugs illegally on the streets. For example, in California, medical marijuana is very avid. It's very popular. You can walk down a street and ask a guy and buy the same amount of marijuana, for example, for a third of the price that you would from the government. So why don't we just legalize it and the government can still put these people in jail that are selling it illegally because they're still going to sell it illegally? A lot of people say the government only wants to arrest people to get revenue and put these people in jail. These people will still be penalized for selling it illegally. And people will still sell it illegally. So my question is, why don't we just legalize it? Because these people will still sell it on the streets in Maryland, in any state. So.
Okay, so if that's California's policy, that's an incredibly ineffective policy. The government should never sell something for 3 times the price that illegal drug dealers will. They should just make it cheaper, because they obviously can. Secondly, in terms of whether or not we should just legalize it, the problem is if you have unregulated substances, you are playing into an existing market of criminal dealers who not only sell drugs, but also engage in prostitution, human trafficking, gun trafficking, all of these other kind of harms. So you're simply saying that the current activities they are doing are legal. They aren't going to suddenly turn around and be like, oh, actually now I'd like to open an off-license where I'd like to sell them legally, because they already have a criminal enterprise. So you have to make that kind of selling illegal.
I mean, I think under my side, obviously there would still be a few people selling it illegally in the same way that you do still get black market cigarettes and black market alcohol. But the point is, it is much easier to go to shops and buy it, and most people will make that choice. So while it's not perfect, obviously, you can clamp down on this. It would be more than just a slap on the wrist if you were caught selling it illegally. But for the majority of people, it's much safer if it is legal and you can buy it in shops.
My question is, who's going to be bankrolling the addicts to go to these doctor visits and to go to the pharmacy to buy these prescriptions? For instance, Medicare patients who receive state-funded insurance. I know that I don't want to work every day, and I don't choose to do drugs. I don't want to pay for them to be able to go to a doctor and receive their drugs, or to go to the pharmacy and get their drugs. So, how does that supposed to work?
So it's probably difficult for us to answer that because we come from a country with socialized healthcare. So the system here is incredibly complicated. But in general, it is better to pay. So pharmaceutically manufactured heroin is incredibly cheap. It costs pennies to make. However, the costs of dealing with someone's healthcare problems when they take heroin that is cut with concrete or cut with other things is much greater. Moreover, I don't know whether you do this in the US, but in the UK, we have to fund rehabilitation for people who are addicted to heroin. We have to fund their drugs which you take in order to get off heroin, which are much more expensive. So having this policy at the beginning is actually much cheaper and will save society money.
Yeah, I mean, I think my objection in terms of pharmacy selling it is that obviously you do normally have to pay for prescriptions, so it's still the fact that you are selling it. Whereas I think if it is, apart from Medicare patients, if it's just in shops, that is never costing the taxpayer money, and in fact, you are paying the taxpayer because we do tax. I know tax laws are different here, but I'm pretty sure in every state you tax cigarettes and you tax alcohol. So actually, all the potential harms that are caused by the drug problems are sort of made cost-effective by getting some of the money back for the government every time they sell these drugs.
I think that part of what you're saying about how you have a choice in the drugs that you use and that they don't really affect other people to an extent. Well, I think that they really can affect other people because there's a lot of times they haven't developed ways to identify people that are under the influence of other drugs other than alcohol. Say if somebody's driving, the chances of somebody getting pulled over if they're driving recklessly are, of course, increased, but that's not to say that they will always be caught. There's only so many law enforcement officers compared to everybody that's out on the street driving. So in theory, somebody that's all high on crystal meth or on heroin could be nodding out or could be not operating the vehicle, obviously, at full capacity. And they could cause a major accident, and that could definitely impact the lives of somebody else. And it also is would cost a lot more money, because I think that the issue with what somebody else was saying about the Medicare is that it's not going to cost the government money, but that the people who are paying for it, the people that are paying the taxes, that money is not benefiting them at all, because, like she was saying, a lot of the people won't use drugs, and that money that they're being taxed on, or that the other people are spending for taxes, is not going back into projects that are necessarily going to benefit the citizens.
Okay, so there were sort of 2 points to that question. So
Yes.
Firstly, the safety thing. I mean, we say people can drink, but that they can't drink and drive. Given the fact you now have no government officials fighting the war on drugs, there probably are more law enforcement officers. But the point is that we allow people to do things that we think they have a principled freedom and right to do, but then we stop them doing those activities when they become harmful, right? So in the way that you have the right to have children, if you can, but if you then are a bad parent, then we would intervene. So in the same way, you should have the right to take drugs, but obviously you shouldn't be allowed to operate operate machinery if you've taken those drugs, and you can put limitations in place. And then secondly, the thing that you were saying about tax and how taxpayers might be supporting people's harmful activities. I mean, that's true anyway now, in that addicts are obviously treated by hospitals and often don't have incomes. That becomes better when you are making money from selling the drugs. But thirdly, that's true of every healthcare system, because not everyone is going to get the same diseases. You know, you say people can go and drive NASCAR or do very dangerous activities that are completely legal, and they may harm themselves. I mean, that will cost the taxpayer, but we say on balance, that's probably fine, because individually as taxpayers, it's costing us very little, and it means that we will be cared for whatever things may befall us, be it our fault or not. So I think it's mitigated better, at least if you're making money from the drugs, rather than spending extra money to monitor and stop the selling and buying of drugs.
Just as an addendum to that, criminalization of drugs doesn't make drug driving any less likely. Because when you had criminalization of alcohol in the United States, rates of drink driving actually went up, precisely because you often have to drive in order to access it. So actually, there's no reason in terms of like safety as to why you'd want to criminalize something. It makes it more likely that people are going to use vehicles when they're high.
Yes, we do. 2 more minutes.
So you want to legalize heroin and methamphetamine. I guess, how would you even start to control that when they can barely control drinking and driving as it is right now? I just came from court where a gentleman drove 10 miles while extremely high on heroin and very drunk, swerving all over the road, never got pulled over, and ended up hitting me on my motorcycle. I could be, dead right now because they can't control drinking and driving as it is, or heroin, or driving under the influence of heroin as it is.
I'm terribly sorry that happened to you, and I do not, my proposition is definitely not to encourage or indeed increase deaths. But I think the point is that you can monitor it, you can have more police on the streets, you can tell people, make it very obvious to have public campaigns, just like you do about drink driving. But also, if these things are legal, there's less need to sort of, get in your car and speed away from where you've bought the drugs or consumed the drugs because you're not being monitored. You can do it in the safety of your own home, or if there's public places you can do it there. And I think there's less need often for people to conceal the fact they've taken these drugs. They can just be high, and that will be fine, and they don't have to then be high and then try and drive away and pretend to be sober and not under the influence.
Also, it's not true to say that you can't control it. Rates of drink driving, both in this country and the UK, have been steadily decreasing over time, precisely because you have more effective manners of policing it and campaigns about awareness about how terrible it is. So social progress doesn't always move in a negative direction. Things can get better.
Okay, now we are going to go into final remarks, but before we do that, just keep in mind that at the end you will be able to put in your idea or put in your vote for one of these debaters, so go ahead.
Sorry, I'll just get my timer up. So, ladies and gentlemen, Kate and I agree on a lot of things in this debate. I hope you weren't sort of hoping for more sort of angry shouting and yelling, but I think you have to be sensible about these things, because the war on drugs costs America millions, if not billions, every year. You lock up hundreds of thousands of people for buying and selling these drugs, and current policies are not working and have not been working for years, but politicians doggedly stick to them, often stupidly, and they shouldn't. So what Kate and I have agreed on in this debate is we've both said that most drugs should be legal in terms of consumption and buying them, that most people should be allowed to do that because of choice, but also because of practicality, and that for hard drugs, we'd still want people to have a way to get it. So Kate would give it to people through pharmacies. I would just say you can buy it from the shop. So ultimately, what this debate comes down to is exactly what things you can and can't consent to, and sort of should be allowed to make that decision freely. And secondly, exactly what the different nuances are in terms of the safety and practicalities in this debate. So they're the two things I'm going to talk to you about, mirroring the structure of my speeches, which hopefully means I identified the right points of discussion when I began planning my speeches. Okay, so on consent. Broadly, I think your life is your own, and for your life to be the best and most meaningful life and funnest life for you, whatever that means. You as an individual should be allowed to make whatever decisions you want. You do not have to aim to go to Harvard and become a lawyer and then become a politician. That is not the only life choice up to you. You do not even have to identify work as the most important thing. Enjoyment and pleasure could be that, and I think because of that, you should be allowed to take whatever substances aid your life in whatever way you want. And Kate's objection has been one about danger, that certain things you cannot consent to because they are so horrific or may have such horrific impacts upon you, and that your future life will be severely impacted. My objections to this are as follows. Firstly, you never know what the impact of anything may be on you. You never know if a college course will be right for you, if the fact you are guzzling cups of soft drink that are this big will not cause you diabetes in 5 years' time because you're consuming huge amounts of sugar. Similarly, even with safe drugs, different people have different reactions to them. But I think ultimately you can choose whether to take that uncertainty on yourself. And yes, in your future life, you may be addicted. I think you can choose, hard as it may be, to leave that addiction. But in the same way that anything is hard, in the same way that if you sign up to become a miner and you're doing work that's incredibly physically dangerous, but you need the income and the money, it is hard to leave that career, right? Especially if there isn't much work available in your local area in other industries, but you can make that decision. So ultimately, I think you can choose to do this, and you should be allowed to. But now on safety. So what have we heard? We've heard from Kate that firstly, actually, under her side, dealers won't be able to sustain their activities because they'll be only coming to first-time users, and prescriptions will only cost $1. I think that's firstly untrue. Prescriptions, given the fact drug companies have such a stranglehold on medical facilities in this country, will often be very expensive, and more so than if private companies and the free market impacted it in the way it would work in shops. But secondly, also, that's not true, right? Because dealers also build up customer loyalty and encourage people not to go out. The moment you say buying these drugs are illegal, people do feel scared. They do worry that what they are doing has been illegal, and it is not as easy as going, oh, well, it will be safer, I will go to a doctor. When you are addicted, and if Kate's claims are true about how addictive these drugs are, you are more likely to stay in the criminal underbelly and never get the help you need, but also harm society more than if you were doing this in the open and you were being monitored and you were getting safer drugs. I've also been accused of allowing drug dealers to continue and only having a slap on the wrist for those who sell things, not in shops. That is untrue. I would want severe policing of this because I want the government to make money off people's habits in the same way we do with all foods and all activities, but also because I do recognise this could be dangerous. It is better for the taxpayer if you're already getting revenue back, so any of the problems that exist on either side are easier to tackle because there is more money in the government pot. Lastly, on the issue of going on to harder drugs, if that's true on both sides, that's also true on Kate's model. But notice you can't, if you want a higher high, as it were, suddenly go to a pharmacy and say, I'm an addict, if you're patently not. You do then have to go to the drug dealer, and you do then become addicted, and you do start buying from them. At least at first, you are funding all of those criminal activities. It is again safer if you can do that in the pharmacy, in a shop, and buy it there. But it's also unclear that why you would, because different drugs have different highs. And if you find your drug and the one you like, and it is relatively cheap because of the free market, and it is successful in getting you as high as you like, I think people will opt for that. So because people can choose, and they should do so in the safest way possibly, we should legalise all drugs.
Okay, similarly, I'm going to go over the main questions this debate has brought out, but unsurprisingly, give you different answers. So the first question of whether or not taking drugs is something that people can meaningfully consent to and we should respect. Alice wants to tell you that it is like other choices that restrict your future choices, where you go to university, if you drink alcohol, etc. I'm saying, and I think this is reasonable, and you will understand this is reasonable, that we can distinguish between how restrictive these choices are. So yes, when I started debating, or if I drink, that choice is restrictive of the things that I can do the next day, or the day after that, or in future days. But that is not equivalent to taking crystal meth or taking heroin, because the decision to do that is, I believe, equivalent to the decision to commit suicide. It is by taking crystal meth, by taking heroin, you are shortening your life immensely. You are also changing your life fundamentally in a way that you couldn't have imagined. You are telling yourself that you have no ability to make meaningful future choices because all of those choices will be clouded by your addiction. So, Alice tells you you can't know the consequences of your future actions. That's generally true. I think we can know the consequences of taking crystal meth. We can see those consequences every day. We can see that when people take that first hit of crystal meth, the most likely path for them is that they will become an addict and their life will be ruined forever. Because we can predict that, we should protect people from that. Moreover, Alice hasn't told you why people take drugs. She presents this idea of people have choices and it's meaningful and we should respect because people are different. Happy, successful people don't take crystal meth. People take these drugs out of desperation. They take them because they've had terrible home lives, because they have terrible lives now, because the lives that they're living they're not happy with. So their choice to take these drugs isn't something that's considered. You don't sit there and think, you know what, shall I go to Harvard or shall I become a meth addict? Let's think about that, right? These are people whose choices are already restricted. All Alice is doing is allowing them to restrict them even further. That's not a meaningful choice that these people should make. They also should be protected from drug dealers who tell them it's the reasonable choice, who lie to them because these are people who don't have a lot of information, and restrict those choices forever. Then on which side do we get more social harms? I think it's clear on both sides there's a major hit to the war on drugs, and that will generally be better, although probably a bit better on my side. But there's another social issue that Alice is just unwilling to deal with, and that is the very fact that we have drug addicts. This isn't a positive choice people are making. This isn't something that's equal to going to Harvard, or that we should view equally morally. This is something that has enormous consequences to society. There are entire communities blighted by drug addiction, families blighted by drug addiction. This isn't something society is bound to respect. And on my side, we think will be less addicts. There will obviously be more addicts on Alice's side, where all that you need to go and get heroin is to go to the off-license. On my side, you have to go to a doctor, and there are certain really harmful drugs you can never get. So there are obviously less addicts on my side. That is something that is a social good. That is something that outweighs so much stuff that Alice has brought you. Then this question of whether or not we should fund people's poor choices, because necessarily the model that I'm proposing means there's some government intervention here. And I think you should fund people's poor choices when, A, you can't prevent them from making those choices. Criminalizing drugs isn't stopping people taking drugs. There needs to be a better way. Moreover, when you have to pay the cost of the cleanup for people's poor choices. At the moment, you're not stopping people taking drugs, and you're paying for their healthcare costs, you're paying for the fact they're unemployed, and you're paying for the fact that they end up in prison. Bear in mind, people who end up in prison on drug charges are costing the state $42,000 per year. That is an enormous cost. What I'm saying is, maybe put some of that money, front-end it, put it into healthcare systems, put it into providing people with the drugs they need that are cleaner and safer and in a way that you can monitor. You may not like doing this, but it's a more effective policy because less people will be addicts and less people will be a drain on the state in the long term. And surely that's what we have to do in terms of being effective. Then the last thing is which better combats the drug war. This has obviously been probably the most messy part of the debate in terms of what will drug dealers do, what will addicts do, etc. And a lot of that depends upon the fine-tuning of particular policies. But I believe that when the state has an a priori legalization of all recreational drugs, this does two things. It sends out a message that that is something that is legitimate and that the state thinks is acceptable. You have more people taking drugs under that world. People's choices are obviously influenced by what the government says and the message that they send out. Moreover, an a priori legalization gives free rein to people who want to create worse drugs, more harmful. Note that the drugs that are being created now are more harmful than anything that has gone before. That is the direction that we're going in. Alice would have you legalize not only the drugs that currently exist, but all future and more harmful drugs. That is the world I do not want to live in, incredibly proud to oppose.
Okay, now at this time, how this is going to work is that once we say someone like Alice, if you agree with Alice, you'll stand up, and same thing with Kate. So at this time, if you believe that Alice had the best argument, please stand at this time.
Yay, you're my favorites.
Okay, please be seated. And if you believe that Kate had the best argument, please at this time stand. Thank you very much. Please be seated. Well, thank you very much, both. That was a very, very exhilarating debate. Definitely one of the best that I've seen. So, on behalf of the Honors Council and Chesapeake College, please join me in thanking Kate Brooks and Alice Huntley for an outstanding debate. And in the same way, thank you very much for coming and watching, and I hope it was enjoyable to you, and I'm sure they did too. Thank you for coming, and have a nice day.